I want to tell you a story today. So I invite you to settle in, get comfortable. You might even want to close your eyes. It happened years ago, but I will never forget that day, for it was the most profound one of my entire life. It started out like any other, but in the late morning, there was a buzz around the village. Someone had been washing their clothes out by the lake, and they sighted Jesus in a boat on the water. And what happened after this happened oh so quickly. We quickly loaded up our family, and before we could think about food or the necessities of life, we were on our way. Everything within me told me that we had to go where Jesus was going and meet him at the point he got out of the water. My heart had been so heavy, and I had been disillusioned. The word from a few days back was still sending shockwaves into my whole body. John, the one that they called the Baptist, had just died. Well, truthfully, he'd been politically executed by Herod Antipas. It numbs the entire being to consider the ways that the powers can enact their violence upon the people. Jesus must have known about John too. I suppose he needed some time alone to let grief do its work, also to get away from the places of the empire's violent reach. As we were leaving the village to follow him, I had a moment's pause, wondering if we should just let him be. But I also knew that I needed relief from an empire that kills its prophets. So I put aside my concerns about being a bother, and our family made our way on foot, slowly moving along the water's edge, further from the places of familiarity to an outer place. Whereas we got further away and closer at the same time, it felt like we were able to breathe more easily. All the while, Jesus in a boat slowly made his way upon the waters. We stayed close enough that we were able to see where he was nearing the shore. But he was still just a bit ahead of us. By the time, though, that he stepped out of the water, we were close. The crowd was still somewhat small, but we weren't close enough that we could greet him. I was close enough, though, that I could see his eyes. I wish there were words that would allow me to explain what I saw in those eyes. The best I can do is tell you that there was so much compassion, but it was interwoven with sorrow as well. John's death must have weighed so heavy on him, but he didn't turn us away. In fact, he did the opposite. He called suffering people to himself. Many there were sick and in need of healing, and he healed them. Even the healthy ones among us, at least most of us, were from the lower rungs of society. The fact that he didn't shoo us away like so many others had before that was its own kind of healing for the soul. I suppose that kind of care is contagious. So it was only a small surprise how that crowd grew as people from surrounding villages began to join us as well. As more came and some pushed past us, it also meant that my family and I were not quite so close to Jesus anymore. But it was enough simply to be there and to see it all unfold. That entire day was so light and free, different from what we had called normal. I lost track of time. And without even being aware, the entire day had passed by and the sun was starting to set on the crowd. Only then did I realize in the excitement of it all that we had skipped the day's meals. I began to realize my own hunger. I could see through their discomfort that others were starting to get hungry too. I heard within my mind the voice of responsibility. How could I feed the children? How would any of us here find enough for us to eat? But I also knew that we weren't leaving a moment like this. In fact, this was exactly where we needed to be. But there was a mounting, nervous energy within the crowd. I could see a couple of the disciples as they were near Jesus, and they were very nervous. They were frantic, scurrying around. They were whispering to one another. You could tell they felt a sense of responsibility to keep this large crowd under control. One even went and disrupted Jesus as he was about to heal a small child. I couldn't tell what they said to one another, but the two of them kept looking out at the crowd, which I suppose by this point had grown to nearly 20,000 people, if you counted everyone there. And even though it was getting late and we were hungry, nobody left. As they talked, I could tell Jesus was signaling to the disciples to do something about this situation, which I assumed by this point had to do with our hunger. One disciple pointed in the direction of our village and then toward a few others, and I assume he was saying to Jesus, just send them home. I could almost make out the words and the hands thrown up in the air as if one disciple was saying, we don't have anything. Another held up a basket with a meager amount of fish and just the smallest amount of bread. I guess it was better than nothing, but not really. I couldn't hear Jesus, but by his presence, it was clear he did not agree with his disciples. It also seemed as if he wanted to settle their concern. And then he had this look of resolve in his eye. And he started pointing out instructions to the disciples as if he was orchestrating what was going to happen next. And then Jesus turned from instructing the disciples to instructing us. He spoke loudly, but in that sea of people, I couldn't quite make out his words. But when we saw those closest to him start to form into groups, and then they sat down, we knew what he was asking of us. It was then, for the very first time that day, we were no longer a sea of people just hoping to get close to Jesus. As I now, for the first time, looked at the people sitting around me. And in that moment, I saw them. We weren't just a crowd. Next to me was a person, someone else who, like me, would drop everything and head out to a deserted place just for the chance to be near Jesus. I noticed a few rows away from me, there was one of our neighbors. And there was a sense of comfort knowing that they were there with us too. I felt compassion rise in me as I saw the faces of those around me. And when I heard and felt my own empty stomach, I thought of theirs as well. We really saw one another. But then my attention was drawn back to Jesus. We still couldn't hear him, but his actions resounded. He took the small amount of food that one disciple was holding. It was as if gratitude welled up within him as he looked up to the sky. And then he gently placed his hand above that meager amount of bread and fish. And it must have been a bit of a chore, but he broke what was there into pieces. And he gave what he had to his disciples. There was such beauty, and there was reverence in this moment. So much so that the crowd around us became silent. I nearly forgot how curious the scene was and how confused I was by what was unfolding. I was mostly sure that Jesus wasn't trying to taunt us. He had to know we were so hungry. But if he wasn't taunting us, what was he doing? To this day, as I reflect upon my story, I can't entirely explain what happened next. He gave the small amount of food to the disciples, and they started to distribute it to the crowd. And well after it should have all been gone, they were still at it, giving more bread, more fish to the people who had been seated on the grass in front of us. People around me started to talk. They spoke in subdued voices. This was such a reverent moment. But we were also getting really excited. Some tried to whisper, saying it was a miracle that was unfolding. Others said that they could see people around them digging into their own packs and coming up with food out of their bags. However it happened, there was so much abundance. And it had only been a moment earlier, my stomach reminded me of those deep feelings of scarcity. I was prepared by the time the disciples came close to us. And to be honest with you, I still can't remember if we received food from a disciple's basket or if someone close by had offered us fish and bread from their pack. In any case, the crowd got very quiet again as the people behind us were served too. It got even quieter. And not just because we were eating, that was part of it. But we also settled into silent awe and wonder and the slowness that is brought on by being really, really full. I wish I could convey it in feelings, not just in words, because it was so much more than a full belly. I was satisfied. So was my family and the people around us. Everyone had enough. Well, almost everyone had enough. It was at that moment that I noticed somebody nearby who had stepped away for a few moments, and they had missed the basket as it passed by their way. And it was then, for the first time that day, I remembered that when Jesus got out of the boat, it took him a little bit of time to get situated. And I had a few moments to forage some berries from a nearby bush. I guess in the sense of scarcity that was growing throughout the day, I had forgotten what I had. But in this moment, I thought, I should share. But before I reached in and offered these berries, a sharp thought came into my mind. Don't give the berries away. You're going to need them for the journey home. But just as quickly, a second, more relaxed thought followed. We had just eaten enough to be satisfied for many hours. And besides, everything we had just seen made me wonder if I really needed to make my decisions based upon scarcity. It was so joyful to reach into my pack and to hand those berries to one of the only people in the crowd who hadn't had a chance to eat yet. Once we had all eaten, the disciples collected the leftovers. Leftovers. After feeding a crowd like that, can you even imagine it? Somehow, each one of those 12 followers of Jesus stared at a full basket of bread and fish in their hands. I loved the confused but grateful and relieved looks that were on their faces. I focused in on a couple of them, and I love and saw how they looked down at the basket and then looked up at the crowd and then back at the basket again. It was a moment of awe. That day, our bellies and our hearts were full. There was more than enough with Jesus. It means the world to me that you've allowed me these moments to share my story. Maybe you've heard it before. I'm sure others will tell this story from their own vantage point too. It's certainly one worth repeating, because that day changed my life. I'll never forget the compassion in Jesus' eyes, the time he spent healing and caring for so many people, for us. I hope you'll take this story to heart too. Maybe it could be like one of those little seeds Jesus was always talking about. The ones that start out so small, but once planted in the heart, grow to be something so very big. As I think back to that day, one of the images seared in my memory is the look on the disciples' faces. They were so nervous, at least at the start of it all. And I get it. But as things unfolded, Jesus allowed them to be part of the miracle. And you could tell that they learned something important that day. I also remember the sense of reprieve that I felt. A little break from the empire that kills its prophets. Out there in the far out places, Jesus showed us a better way. A better kind of community. One where we can really see one another. one where we can start to understand that there's always enough among us. But what seared in my soul was the look of gentle and yet fiery compassion blazing in Jesus' eyes. I think about it every day, and I can tell you this. I've never been able to sit down at a table quite the same way ever again. Each time the host, whoever it might be, takes bread and gives thanks, lifts it up and breaks it before passing it around the table, I get a renewed sense of satisfaction in my belly and in my heart. When Jesus sets the table, there's always enough.